My name is Awista Atkins, and I will be your webinar facilitator for today. This webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. Before we get started, I want to familiarize you with some of the features available and how the environment works. If you look at the top of your screen, you will see an icon of either a person with their hand raised or just a hand. With that icon, you can either raise hand, agree, disagree, or step away. Now your screen should look similar to this graphic here. To the bottom left, you will see a box that says Files. Here you will find today's presentation. Please feel free to download a copy for yourself. Simply click the item you would like to download, then click the arrow pointing downwards, and you will be prompted to save or print the materials based on your device's permissions. The second box that states web links to houses today's survey, as well as any other links that are found throughout the presentation. Lastly, to the right of the screen, we have a chat box available. This is how you would communicate to the instructor and NLC staff. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to interact by using the chat box. Simply type your message and hit enter or click that up arrow icon button to submit. We encourage class participation, so please feel free to write in those questions or comments. Tech support issues should also be submitted here. It is with a great pleasure that I introduce Cheryl. Cheryl will be discussing NAHASDA required policies and procedures, day 1. Alrighty, Cheryl.
Hey, Cheryl, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Thank you. I am so sorry.
All good.
So welcome everyone to NAHASDA Required Policies and Procedures, Day 1. Good afternoon. As we normally do, we usually start our meetings in Indian country with prayers and smudging, so I did do that before we started. This presentation is courtesy of the Native Learning Center, and the webinar is being recorded for your future use. This is the information should you ever need anything or have any questions, and you'll also find it at the end of the presentation. My name is Cheryl. My Anishinaabe name is Redbird Woman, and I am Loon Clan. I come from Kenoshinconning. That's how you pronounce it in my language. It's called the Place of the Pike, and it's the Bay Mills Indian Reservation, and we're a Ojibwe or Chippewa people. Our reservation is located at the top of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and our waters actually border Canada. We're like 5 miles away. I served as my tribe's director of housing for over 28 years. And during that time, I was honored to serve as the chairwoman of the National American Indian Housing Council. I was termed out for 4 years on that. And previous to that, I served for 12 years. I started as the secretary and then became the vice chair. I was also very privileged to serve the people of our housing associations. Our tribes that have housing entities have the ability to join housing organizations that serve in their areas, their jurisdictions. The Northwest, the Alaskan villages, the Southwest. I'm trying to think the ones in Montana. So there's Nevada Cal. There's several organizations that are throughout Indian country. I served as the chairwoman for the Great Lakes Indian Housing Association. So that's all of the tribes, the 31 tribes that sit around the Great Lakes. We also work hand in hand with the USET organization. That's the United Southern and Eastern Tribes, because we're all served under the same ONAP office, and it's basically all the tribes east of the Mississippi. So if you get a chance to ever participate, those regional meetings are very, very beneficial to you. So these documents will be available for the next 3 days. I would definitely suggest, if you don't have a copy of the NAHASDA statute, the regulations at 24 CFR Part 1000 or Part 200 of the Uniform Administrative Requirements, that you download them. You can print them off. I keep them bound in a book, or you can keep them right on your desktop. But that's where you need to find all of your rules. And I'll explain that. We'll walk through that process. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that, but that's where you also find out what policies are required. Okay, so those are the most important documents that you have within your organization, besides your housing board charts and your things like that, your ordinances. So there's also separate program guidances in here that I hope will be very, very helpful to you, because they're all things that will require policies if you're subject to them. So like Appendix 6 is your program guidance. It's local cooperation agreements. Now, this would only take place if you're building off of reservation land. Anybody in Oklahoma and Alaska, or a tribe that's building off of their reservation, you're supposed to have local cooperation agreements. So you should need to have a policy and a procedure whose job it is to go seek those out, to make those amendments once you have them in place and you continue to build. Your conflict of interest in housing. You have 2 conflict of interest policies that are required. One in admissions and then one in the administration of your contracts. So you need policies and procedures for those also. Your Board of Commissioners. Now, this also ties back to that housing ordinance. If you're still operating under your 1937 Housing Act ordinance, you weren't supposed to, those board members aren't supposed to receive a stipend. So that would be another document that you need to take a good look at and become familiar with. But you should have a guidance policy on your stipends. It should cover basically how much they're being paid. Do they have to be in attendance for the whole meeting? Are you taxing them? All those little things that they need to know when you onboard them. Tribal wage rates. We still have a lot of our tribes that get in trouble over this one. Davis-Bacon requires that we, if we spend over $2,000 on a carpentry activity, that we pay Davis-Bacon, unless we have an adopted tribal wage rate in place. And we speak to that when we're in the IHP. The problem with that is a lot of times, especially if you have turnover within your housing agency, you say, oh yeah, we have tribal wage rates. And they're basically thinking, yeah, the tribe says how much an entry-level secretary is going to make. And they have a wage grid for their employees. Those tribal wage rates are totally different than the tribal wage rates that they ask about in your IHP and your APR. Those are to replace or work with Davis-Bacon. So you need policies in place if you're going to adopt a tribal wage rate, so you don't have to pay Davis-Bacon when you expend over $2,000 in construction. The Program Guidance 2010-03 is under Appendix 8. That has to do with our affordable housing activities and the allowable expenses, what we're allowed to spend there. So that's a good guidance for you to look at and can be helpful with your policies also. Appendix 9, limiting housing to Indian families. We do have the ability to do that. We receive our money as an appropriation through Congress expressly for helping low-income Native Americans or Alaska Natives. This allows us to give preference and the fair housing laws and things like that, we're not discriminating because we're actually appropriated that money for that purpose. Now, should you mix your money, you get a low income tax credit program or something else in there, those other guidelines could kick in and you can get in trouble when you try to put forth that preference. So you need to make sure that you have a full understanding of that and that your policies and your procedures also discuss that. Low income families under NAHASDA, we are allowed to assist them that are between 80 and 100%, and sometimes over 100%. But there are very, very strict guidelines with that. You have to put forth something within your Indian housing plan. It's called a 10% authority that you'd like to help people that are between 80 and 100%. Somebody has to make sure that you're doing it correctly. You have to have the policies and procedures in place for that. And you have to make sure that that documentation is filed with that application. And you have to, like I said, track that 10% authority. Now, those situations when somebody is over 100%, it's usually only under the circumstance when the tribe deems them essential. So therefore, you have to have an essential families policy, and you have to have the form that you've deemed them essential. So those will be provided throughout the 3 days. That's things we're going to talk about here. But you need to have the background and the guidance and the laws that basically tell you why you have to write that policies, to make sure that when you do write the policy and procedure, you know why. And you can explain that to your tribal council or your housing board or your constituents. You know, your Appendix 15 is a policy status table. We're going to discuss that also and how you should be storing your policies. Insurance requirements under Indian Housing Block Grant, that's under 13. You know, that ties to useful life, and you're going to have useful life policies. We've got some samples and, you know, things there also. But you have to be really, really careful with that, because basically anything almost over $5,000, you should be requiring insurance, whether it be a down payment assistance program or a rehab program or an energy assistance. When you're utilizing that NAHASDA dollar, you have to protect it. You not only have to protect it with that useful life, but you have to protect it with that insurance. Personnel information, how you're supposed to protect the information of your applicants and your tenants, how you're supposed to store it, how you're supposed to send it to HUD if they require it. Some of that is outlined within Appendix 14, and we're going to talk about that a little bit also. The redaction when you have to send something out. As I said, the useful life and binding commitments, 16 and 18 speak to that. One is a prior guidance, but it has examples in it that 18 doesn't have, so they're both here. And then if your program income, you're supposed to have policies and procedures in effect about the spending and the use of program income. And that's found under your Appendix 17. So one other thing that I was asked that I thought I would explain here rather than put it in a slide. If you go up and you look at Appendix 10, it says Program Guidance 2013-05, and then you see that R in parentheses. When you see that R, it means that that program guidance replaces a previously issued program guidance. So what you normally would do is go back. I kept mine in a binder. I have every guidance back to the beginning of time. I had it in the one office, and I have them, you know, right here also, because sometimes they're hard to get your hands on. For some reason, sometimes the HUD website will have a couple of them that are missing, and that just drives me crazy, because when you start looking between those three guidance documents, it'll send you back and forth. And a lot of times it'll refer to one of those PG, the program guidance, or that PIHA, that notice. So I like to have them right here so I can look at them to see what it's referring to. So I would go back to that older one and I would mark on it, but I would keep it there because of the fact that It could be referred to in a further document, and I would put replaced by, 2013-05, or whatever number on that one, but I would still keep that one in place, just so you know. So that's what that R means when you look at that. So our objectives hopefully are going to be to identify the required policies and the certifications and the compliance that your housing organization should have in place to protect you, to make sure you're as efficient as you possibly can be, and to prepare you for your audits and your HUD grants monitoring visits. In sections 203 and 207 of NAHASDA, the implementing regulations found at 24 CFR, Part 1000, remember that's the one we were talking about, as well as the uniform requirements at 2 CFR Part 200, it requires that you as a recipient develop written policies and procedures to provide guidance for your programs and to implement effective internal controls. So our agenda, hopefully, I can get closed up around 3:20 because there's always a survey at the end, and for some of the questions that you're going to get. What mandates each required policy? That's one of the things we're going to touch on. Your housing policies, your policies and procedures. There's an A&O policy outline in here to make sure, and maybe that's something you want to grab as your policies while you're taking this for the next couple of days to see, do we have this in our A&O policy? The non-low income assistance policy, that's what we were just chatting over, how we can help these people, if they're law enforcement, because I didn't mention that one either. Your self-monitoring policy, you have to have one of those. When your ED or whoever prepares your APR for the year, they're certifying that you're doing self-monitoring, and you should have a self-monitoring policy in place with some type of a calendar saying what you're going to do and when you're going to do it. Your grievance policies. You're supposed to have a grievance policy for your tenants and for your staff. So you should actually have 2 grievance policies. The other federal laws that are in place that will require policies and procedures. Your labor standards. We chatted about that just for a second when it came to Davis-Bacon and your tribally determined wage rate. Your useful life, we talked about that a little bit already. You have what you have to have in place once you start using those NAHASDA dollars. And the type of, we didn't really touch on the type of agreements that you have to do, to the attachment to the land, procurement, and then again, those 2 forms of conflict of interest that you have to have. So hopefully you guys will help me do some of these. There's nothing worse than putting up a poll question and nobody answering it. So I'd kind of like to see who my audience is. How long have you been working in housing? 0 to 6 months, 7 to 12 months, 1 to 3 years. If you could put that up for me, my girl. 4 to 5 years, 6 to 10 years. I'm a lifer. Okay, we have a poll thing there we go, guys. I'm so sorry. We'll get better at this.
Sorry about that, guys.
Leroy's young. Antonio's been there a while. 1 to 3, 2.5. Oh, you're a Yazzie. I know some Yazzies. 6 years in NAHASDA. Russell, are you from Alaska? No. Michael Chavez, your name threw me. I lost a dear friend by the name of Michael Chavez. I found out this about a couple of months ago. I think he was from the Pueblo of Zuni. Fairbanks, yay! But you're living in Anchorage. That makes sense. Why? Just from your response, I knew where you were from. Oh, Nadine, yes, you are a lifer, my girl. Usually when you make it past that certain pillar. Oh, we have somebody else from Alaska. Welcome, Patricia. Thank you guys for all the questions. You can end that if you would. So we've got 9 of you in here that are 0 to 6 months. So you guys are definitely newbies. 7 to 12 months, 4, 1 to 3 years, 4, 4 to 5 years, 17 or 5. Quit moving it around, my girl. Okay, that's all I can read because she made it disappear on me. Thank you very much for completing that one. Okay. What area of housing do you work in? She's going to put up a new one. There we go. Oh, we have 3 executive directors. Oh, quite a few executive directors. Wonderful. That's awesome. Tribal council. I also teach a tribal council course. I don't know what neck of the woods you're from, but we've got one probably coming up in November in person. But I like working with tribal council. I worked with NCAI for 4 years, chairing a couple of their committees. Housing counselors, housing managers. Wow. And we have 2 from ONAP. Welcome. You guys make sure that you make friends with your ONAP staff. They're there to help you. And if they don't know the answer, they have a huge amount of resources. We are so lucky in the Eastern Woodlands area. There's such a really good relationship, and there has been for years with the housing entities and the ONAP staff. And, you know, it came basically down to, we're here to help you. Don't ever be embarrassed because you can't do anything or you don't know something. We're here to make you succeed. And that's what they came out with. And it sounds somewhat reverse because it's like, why would I call the person that's in charge of me to tell them I don't know how to do something? But once you got over that, it was great. And then I ended up taking it one step further. If I didn't know if something was legal, I'd call the auditor. Hey, can I do this? You know, so, and use your TA training. You know, there's so much money for training right now, on-site, virtual, whatever you need. If you don't know how to do something, there's somebody out there that can teach it to you. Not sure what your job is. That's cute. Okay. Another important job. I'm sorry, 8 of you guys, that I didn't come up with one to list you all. I feel bad now. Okay, so you can close that up, my girl. And what would you guys like to learn about? NAHASDA required policies. You want to throw that one up? Other required policies, samples, policies versus procedures. What policies do we need? Writing tips. I don't know what I don't know. Anything that would make work sitting through another webinar worth it. So there will be a little bit of sample language in here, but you have to remember, always, if you can have access to your legal staff, run any policy past them before you even bring it to the board. It's just easier that way. And then if they move it around too much, bring it back to them. That's one thing when I work with tribal leaders, I ask them, would it be possible for the housing entity to use your legal staff? You know, not all the time. You have to be very, very cognizant of their time and their pay scale and everything else involved. But never, ever touch a lease without having legal staff look at it. But your policies and procedures are equally as important. And if they would share that resource with you, and for the tribal council that's in the room also, environmental reviews. We have one of the most heavily regulated programs that there are, and you're going to see that by some of the required policies. And unfortunately, you can have a staff of 50, or I've been in housing entities because I go out and I like to prepare people for audits and their housing monitoring. And sometimes I go in after they go through their housing monitoring and I try to fix some of the things that require attention and additional training. And you can have a staff of 50, like I said, and I've been into them where there's an ED and a maintenance man, and the requirements are just the same. The smaller one doesn't usually get as much money, so they don't get as much into the procurement or the contracting. But the requirements are just the same, and there's a huge amount of them. So environmentals for your tribal council, if you have somebody that can help your housing department with that, that would be a wonderful, wonderful piece of assistance. Okay, required policies, other required sample policies versus procedures, what we need, writing tips. And we, of course, have one that doesn't want to sit through another one. Oh, yeah, Kay, you can close this one up too, my girl. Thank you. Okay. I think we're getting to the end of these for right now. What do you have for policies in place? Select that all that apply. So it's a multiple answer. You should have admissions and occupancy and rental. I don't know how many of you have mutual help. This is another little thing. I've been in places where after 1937 Act, when you built your mutual help homes, you had leadership that very, very much liked mutual help. So you use NAHASDA funds and duplicated that program. Please name them something besides mutual help. It's confusing on various fronts for the HUD staff, for the accounting staff, for people looking at policies, for subsequent EDs that come in. It should be a home ownership sample. You could actually put in parentheses, copied after or similar to the mutual help program, but put a different name on those. It gets confusing. Okay, we got a lot of them here. 17 finance. Okay, so strong in finance and procurement. That's really good. Your home ownership, tenant-based rental assistance. So we got quite a few of you that do that too. That's very interesting. Okay, well, thank you very much. You can close that one up, my girl. What do you guys feel that you need to update? If you would do that one. And I think this is the last one. Yes, it is. The last one, I gigged you to death on policies and polls right now. Your A&O are very, very important. So make sure that they work for you. Your procurement, you need to update. Well, I'll show you an example of that later. Your rehab, okay, your Indian preference, your useful life, non-low-income families. Okay, awesome. So you can close that one up, my girl. Then you can breathe for a while because the last one's at the very end. So developing your policies and your procedures. An official policy is basically a written statement of the program direction intent that is adopted by a majority vote of your governing body. I should have asked how many of you work under a housing board and how many work under the tribal council. It appears in the governing body's official minutes, okay? An actual policy, it's the program direction as you practice, as you currently practice. An effective policy is one that works. Effective procedures is a specific, detailed, and sequential step that when you follow it causes your governing body's desired policy consequences to occur. Now I'm going to give you a little do not, and this is to your tribal council members, this is to your EDs, do not put a policy in place that you are not going to follow. You need to highlight it, red light it, circle, whatever, and come up with something else. I'm going to give you an example. You don't allow unlicensed, non-functioning vehicles on your property. And you have some type of a horrific accident and a kid gets knocked under the blocks, gets hit with the car, squashed, whatever, stuck in a trunk, and they take a drive around your properties. You've got that existing in your policy. and you've got 6 or 7 vehicles that are in that condition, who do you think is going to get sued? Not going to be the homeowner. It's going to be you as an ED or your housing organization. Do not put a policy in place that you're not going to enforce. Get it out. You're setting yourself up for failure. So that's one thing. When you start going through those policies, make sure that you're abiding by them. If it takes bringing your whole staff together and saying either we need to follow this or what can we effectively do, just pay attention to that. So your purpose is to ensure all your housing staff do these things the same way. You can't have Joe in maintenance doing something different than Sally in admissions or advising a tenant differently. You can do that. We don't pay attention to it. You can't do that. It does not matter who walks through the door. And that was one of my most important teachings that I got very, very early on as an ED. I worked under my tribal council. Very unique because we were a housing authority. I let various secretaries all the way to the top of HUD know that over the years. But I worked directly under the tribal council. When I took my position, there was $10,000 TARs. People weren't getting maintenance done. The housing board did nothing but travel. They obviously didn't do any enforcement or make sure that the housing entity wasn't being ran correctly. So I interviewed and I told them, I will accept the job if you terminate the current board of commissioners and you let me work directly under the tribal council. And that's what I did the whole time I was there. One set of hoops, you do what they want ultimately anyway. Within the law, I used to start every time that we would onboard and I'd come in and I'd show them my bracelets. I wear gold. I'm not going to wear silver for anybody. I don't break the law. It's a difficult position. But you have to take that and you have to tell them and you have to draw that line. And, I work within the constraints of the guidelines that are given to me. If you allow me to do that, we'll do really well. And we did. But that's what you do. So fairness, promoting consistency and fairness. So the one gentleman was a lawyer for the tribe. He subsequently became the college dean, principal, whatever. And he used to say, you need to ask yourself, when a tribal member walks in here and you allow them to do something, can you allow every other tribal member that walks in and asks the same thing to do that? If you can't do the same thing for everyone, you shouldn't be doing it. So I kept that with me. And it was very, very good sage advice that kept me out of trouble. So consistency and fairness. Minimizing potential for disputes or legal actions. You do not want to ever have to bring, I got somebody threatening to sue us. In my 28 years, we got threatened to be sued once. We had somebody slip and fall in a parking lot, but my boys kept logs. They kept logs every time that they salted a parking lot, every time they plowed a parking lot. We used Amaranth. They sent somebody to the hospital. The gentleman was intoxicated. That's why he slipped and fell and broke his leg, not because of the condition of the parking lot. The only time that anybody ever threatened to do anything with us. So that's your other thing. Have your maintenance guys keep logs when they do important activities timely like that. Provide a foundation for sound management and supervision. Provide a basis for your auditor justification. And make sure that you ensure transparency. No, this is the way we do it all the time. So what mandates your required policies? The NAHASDA statute is the first document you're going to look at for what mandates your policies. The objectives: to assist and promote affordable housing, better access to your mortgage markets, to promote self-sufficiency, plan and integrate infrastructure, to promote private capital markets. It's broke up into 7 sections. You'd go into section 1 for block grants and grant requirements. 2 is your affordable housing activities. 3 is your allocation of your grant amounts. 4 is your compliance, your audits, and your reports. You should look at this section definitely. 5 is the termination of assistance. 6 is your federal guarantees for financing. 7 is your other housing assistance. So which policies, this is just a few by the way, are required by NAHASDA? Your recertification policy is something that you as a recipient have to decide on. Your selection policy is something that is required by NAHASDA. So there's guidance on that. Your grievance policies is the recipient policy. Your admissions policy is required by NAHASDA. You're going to find, direct things that it instructs you to do. Your maintenance policy is required by NAHASDA. Your calculation of your house payments, how you're going to come up with that amount that you charge them, is required by NAHASDA. Your procurement policy is required by NAHASDA. Your travel, well, it talks about travel, and we'll touch on that later on. You could be using your tribes, or you can have your own adopted. If you have your own adopted, well, then you should be using GSA. Your written waiting list is required by NAHASDA. Criminal background check, that's up to you as a recipient if you're going to do that, but there's guidelines and policies and procedures that you need to put in place if you do. Your collections policy is something else you come up with. Those are some of them. So your regulations are Indian Housing Block Grant regulations. Those little doozies were written in a question, and before I go back, I'm so sorry. When you look at this, the NAHASDA statute is color-coded. It's color-coded by amendment. So anytime that we amend the NAHASDA statute, it'll feature itself in a different color, just so you know that. HUD has the right to convey negotiated rulemaking. If there's a problem or something that they would like corrected within NAHASDA, anytime that they touch the formula, they have to bring together negotiated rulemaking. Or anytime that we are reauthorized, they will convene negotiated rulemaking among the tribes, the lawyers, HUD. And it's a very, very strict process that you go through, but then you'll see those amendments by color. So that's why they're like that. So those regulations are written in a question and an answer format. Used to drive me crazy, but that's not the question that I have, to address the provisions of the statute necessary to implement NAHASDA. The regulations became final in '98, and they've been amended multiple times. There's key regulations. 1010 is the definitions. 12 is non-discrimination. So anytime that you see 1000, that tells you you're dealing with the NAHASDA regs. Then when you want to find out what part of the NAHASDA regs it's sending you to, you look for the number. You open it up, you open the book, and you look for the number. So 14 is going to deal with relocation and real property. We've got very strict rules as far as that goes also. Your administrative requirements would be found under point 26. Conflict of interest is found between 30 and 34 in this part of the regulation. It's also addressed in all the other ones. Records retention, point 36. 101 is affordable housing. 102 is eligible affordable housing activities. 103 is your tenant project-based rental assistance, your TBRA. 104 speaks about your eligible families. 106 to 108 are those families, those special families that require that approval. 110, conditions for non-low-income Indian families participation. And 120 speaks about tribal Indian preference or tribal preferences in selecting families for housing. So there's key program elements. You're going to need policies for all of these areas with the exception of formula, okay? You're going to have policies for your eligible families, for your eligible activities, for your program administration, for your financial management, for your reporting and your record keeping. So 24 CFR Part 1000, these regulatory sections are labeled A through F. General is A, B is your affordable housing activities. Subpart C, if you want to read about your Indian housing plan and your guidelines there. D talks about our allocation, our formula, how we get our money. E is your federal guarantees for financing of your tribal housing activities. And F is your recipient monitoring, your oversight, your accountability. So those regulations are divided into 6 subparts. Subpart A is general. It restates the primary objectives of NAHASDA, contains that authority, that legal authority and regulation, what other federal applicable laws impact NAHASDA, talks about that conflict of interest provisions that apply under our Indian Housing Block Grant, and contains key terms used within the regulations. Subpart B is your affordable housing activities. It contains those regulations and those amendments to implement affordable housing activities, and it includes the following topics: eligible activities, eligible beneficiaries, who can we serve, cost and payment limits, and your existing housing stock. Subpart C is your Indian housing plan, sets forth all the requirements concerning the preparation, submission, review of your Indian housing plan. It requires that, NAHASDA requires that your tribe submit an IHP prior to the receipt of any funds. D talks about that allocation formula. It establishes that formula for allocating amounts available under your NAHASDA for that fiscal year. Subpart E is your federal guarantees for financing of your tribal housing activities. It establishes terms and conditions, which HUD's going to help with those guarantees for obligations issued by the tribe or the TDHE for purposes of financing eligible affordable housing activities. And F is your recipient monitoring, your oversight, your accountability. It addresses monitoring for compliance, performance reports, HUD, tribal reviews, audits, remedies for noncompliance, and includes responsibilities of HUD and you as the recipient. So your uniform administrative requirements, that's 2 CFR Part 200. That replaced like 8 different documents. So if any of your procurement or your finance policies or anything start with A and then 77 or something like that behind it, you need to redo your policies because they're quoting things that no longer exist. 2 CFR Part 200 are your management systems, your written policies, your written procedures, insurance, your drug-free workplace requirements, your procurement policy, your reporting and your record keeping, your conflict of interest and contracts, your audit, your allowable and unallowable cost. We're not allowed to pay tax on properties, things like that with NAHASDA dollars. That's another reason you need those cooperation agreements there. You're not supposed to be paying, hey, my finance girl didn't pay the credit card on time. Guess what? You're not supposed to be paying the interest on that either. You can't be, there's certain things, make sure they know what they are. What other laws and regulations impact our policy? You have to, like I said, we are the most, one of the most heavily regulated programs within Indian country. We have to follow the American Disabilities Act, GAP for our accounting, that generally accepted accounting principles. The Uniform Relocation Act for our Alaskans, the Alaska Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act. We have compliance criteria and citations under admissions and occupancy, CFR 1104 to 110, 120, 124 through 156, NAHASDA sections 203A-1. Management and personnel. You go back to the book of 2 CFR Part 200. Maintenance, 203B and 203E of this NAHASDA statute. Travel, back to the book of 2 CFR 200, this time under section 475. Procurement, again, 2 CFR 200, 317 to 327. 24 CFR 1000.26, so it's in 2 different places. Real property acquisition, 1014, 49 CFR Part 24, so we're in 2 different regulations there. Relocation, another one like that, 1014 and 49 CFR Part 24. Conflict of interest, 1030 through 36, 2 CFR Part 200. 0.112. And then our audits are back under 2 CFR again, Part 200, 500 to 520. So, as I said, we're all over the place. You have to be able to look for these regulations everywhere. Indian preference, 24 CFR, 0.48 through 54. Our labor standards, I'm missing a 1 there. 1000.16, Indian environmental clearance, 1018 through 24, and then 24 CFR Part 58, our lead-based paint. You would often say, and I'm going to touch on this one later on, all of my units were built from in 1990 forward. Well, you still have to know about the lead-based paint if you give down payment assistance, or you're going in and you're doing rehab on units that are not your housing stock or energy assistance. So you have to keep that lead-based paint fresh in your mind there to make sure that you pay attention to it. Accessibility, 24 CFR Part 1012, 24 CFR Part 8, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and then flood insurance requires that we have flood insurance under certain circumstances, under 24 CFR 1000.38. Okay, so your tools, all of those things that we were just talking about. It's a self-determination program, NAHASDA. Our block grant recipients have maximum flexibility in defining your program within those established requirements. So the guidelines for NAHASDA are constructed mainly within those 4 references. That statute is 54 pages, color-coded by amendment. 24 CFR Part 1000 is your NAHASDA regulations. ECFR Title 24 Part 1000, Native American Housing Activities. PIH, that means Public and Indian Housing Notices, and I'm going to show you an example. And then we have EWONAP program guidances. There's a website sample, which is also provided. Our uniform guidance, Part 200, the uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, audit requirements for our federal awards. And generally, our reference material is not duplicative, meaning that if it's in the statute, they're not going to repeat the same wording in the regs, but there's going to be additional rules there. So you have to go and bounce between all of these together. It's quite the task at first. Then you get kind of used to it. So the overview of our statute, our regs, notices, guidances, the NAHASDA sections 2 and 201, and then 24 CFR 1000. The differences, our statutes are federal laws that are written by Congress, the NAHASDA statute, okay? They can only be changed by an act of Congress. It can't be waived because it's a law instituted by Congress. That was Appendix 1. Our regulations, 24 CFR 1000, they can be waived by a departmental secretary. They're written to implement that statute, okay? The Secretary of HUD has the ability to waive it as long as it is not in conflict with the statute. You can find out more about that at 1008. The regulations are usually administered by the federal agency, in our case HUD, designated in the statute to oversee that program. More so than just HUD, we fall under the Office of Native American Programs, ONAP. They are our designated federal agency. So those regulations are found at Appendix 2. So NAHASDA program guidances and public and Indian housing PIH notices are issued by HUD periodically, and they are available electronically. All the way back to when I started, well, years after that even, they used to mail them to our office. There are very few documents that come in the mail anymore. Okay, I'm going to show you examples of that throughout. You have to become familiar with the HUD website, and somebody, especially UEDs in the room, should be checking that on a weekly basis, and you should also have a staff member checking it and printing some of the documents that come off on it, any of your PIH notices, any of your changes, your program guidances, and you should have them bound. So 2010, they announced that hard copy mailing of our notices, and they're available on the website. So this is what the HUD website looks like. This is our PIH notices applicable to Native American programs. This is 2022. 2316, that one was issued June 9th. Maximum amount of funds that can be used. So that's the updated total development cost. The other one is draw down funds, basically. I think that's your investment, but you should make sure that somebody is getting on that website and checking these documents. So your federal laws are written by Congress. They can only be changed by an act of Congress. The regulations are written to implement the statute. They can be waived by the Secretary of HUD. They cannot conflict with the statute. And those regulations are found at 1008. And these are administered by our Office of Native American Programs. Our regulations are notices of official transmittal regarding policy issues, procedural topics. They may not be waived if it relates to the regs or the statute. Then we have notices and guidances. The guidances are written to implement our Indian Housing Block Grant Program, to provide the tools for program management and to help clarify our technical topics. The difference between the NAHASDA statute, the regulations, and the HUD guidances. Those HUD notices are official transmittals to our recipients, typically regarding policy issues, procedural topics. Typically, the information in a HUD notices can be waived by the Assistant Secretary of Native American Programs unless it relates to the regulations or the statute. The program guidances assist our tribes implement our programs to provide tools for program management, clarify various technical topics, especially if we seem to be struggling with it. They get a lot of questions on it or something, they'll put forth that program guidance. To the extent that that program guidances are advisory, they're designed to help our tribes implement our programs, and there is no waiver required or needed. When those program guidances further explain the regulations or the statute, the waiver provisions regarding these documents hold true. The statute, regs, notices, and guidances work together to provide a full picture of our grant recipients' opportunities and responsibilities. The negotiated rulemaking that were charged with drafting the regs decided not to restate any information that was already found within that statute, unless the statute was deemed by them as unclear. Thus, you as a program administrator must be able to refer to both the statute and the regs at the same time to have a complete understanding of NAHASDA. So our PIH notices are issued by the Assistant Secretary for Public and Indian Housing. Our program guidances are issued by the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Native American Programs. These are active links that will get you to that website. I would suggest you go to Code Talk Okay, this is code talk. Right now, CARES Act is on there. You can go up into these parts and click. There's your program guidances. Here's your PIH notices, home ownership, forms, environmental, Dear Tribal Leaders. Even if you are the ED, read the Dear Tribal Leader letters. It'll tell you, I'm sorry, we're not mailing you your formula amount this year. Please click here to find out, the following. NAHASDA, Indian Housing Block Grant, competitive if you're competing for monies. This is the 184, Title VII if you're interested in that. HUD and VASH. We also work with the Department of Native Hawaiians and the Hawaiian programs. These are all of our, on the side, these eastern woodlands, all the tribes east of the Mississippi, basically from here to the East Coast, Chicago to the East Coast. That's where they're at. These are our headquarters, our office there. Our Alaska, all the tribes and villages within Alaska, the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, Seattle, Washington State, Oregon. That's where you go to. There's resources for tribal leaders, TDHEs, native homebuyers, lenders. It's a definite place where you should be spending time. This is a listing of the program guidances from 2022-01, but they go all the way back to the beginning of time. Very, very good reading. As I say, mine are all printed. So for applying guidance, program-specific requirements are followed when provided. Uniform guidance when program-specific requirements are not provided, and accordance with 24 CFR 1026. To understand the program requirements, research your statute, your regulations, your PIH notices, your program notices, and your uniform guidance. You have to look at them all. For your Indian Housing Block Grant program, specific requirements are generally not duplicated. So when I talked about your procurement, we just went through the statute, the regs, the notices and the guidances, the super circular at 200. Now you have your housing and your tribal policies. Your housing and your tribal policies can actually be stricter than any of these. You have to follow them. So I'm going to use procurement. Let's say they raise the procurement threshold to $250,000. Your procurement policy reads $150,000. You go out and make a purchase at $200,000, even though the regs in the statute allow it to go much higher. If your current approved policy is a lower amount, you're going to have an audit finding and a HUD finding. So make sure your policies match up with what you actually want to use. So your housing policies, undated and unapproved policies and procedures. This is one area I work in a lot. I go in and I try to help tribes across the United States achieve NAHASDA compliance or fix or prepare for their monitoring. And I work a lot with the policies. There is nothing worse than going in or even working virtually and saying, please send me a digital copy of all your policies. And they don't have any, or they have 6 copies of the same policy, and half of them they say draft. One says 2020, one says 2011, and the other one says 2006, but you don't have proof of adoption for any of them, or they conflict with each other. This is a huge part of your program. And if you don't do a lot of self-monitoring, this is one of the areas where I would suggest you start with. You have your staff pull every policy that they can find within your housing authority and go put them on your boardroom table. And then find out which one is current. And do you have proof of adoption for that document? Does it say draft? Does it conflict with each other? This is huge. And there is nothing that sets off an alarm to an auditor, to a HUD staffer, or even me as a TA person than walking into that. Okay, guys, don't do it. Try to fix that, if nothing else. If you get nothing out of this course besides that, your policies have to be dated kept with proof of adoption. If your NAHASDA required policies are not fully prepared or updated, your housing program can be relying on obsolete, outdated, incorrect information in the management of your IHBG funded activities, and you can inadvertently be in non-compliance. The best bet is a file cabinet. It's a depository of all of your policies. Just keep one good set in there. You can keep it locked up if you need to, and you can make stacks and stacks of those available to the public, to your staff, or whatever. That depository needs to be taken care of correctly. Review your policies and your procedures, ensure they're compliant with the most current regulations. Prepare a uniform binder, but there's actually so many of them usually that you're going to need a file drawer or other depository which clearly labels each of the policies that are required under NAHASDA and which ones you've adopted. They should be dated with reference showing the approval of your governing body. You should have the copy of the meeting minutes in the same file with them, because they're going to ask for it. Show me where you adopted this. That's one thing you guys have to. Your meeting minutes are one of the most important documents you have. You, as your EDs, especially if you're brand new, scan them. Scan your meeting minutes as soon as you get them, and you lock up those originals. Those should not be available to anybody except your tribal council, your auditors, and HUD when they come in. You can have all the copies of them you want, but you do not want your originals to walk out that door or be altered. Okay, that's another huge thing. Your governance documents that are required should also be kept in that drawer. Your tribal ordinance creating your Indian Housing Authority if you are one. If you're a TDHE, the tribal resolution designating the housing authority as a TDHE, that proof they required us to do that. Your tribal ordinance, I'm sorry, you should have one, period. I spoke wrong. Your bylaws for your Board of Commissioners, if you have one, you need to have the most current with proof of adoption. Your mission statement, you should have a mission statement for your organization, and you should have an org chart. You do not need to name the person in that position, you need to name the person. But HUD's going to want one. Most of the time, your auditors are going to want an org chart. So make sure that that is in that drawer also. This is one of the appendix documents, your governing documents. These are what you need to know, which ones you have. There can be a lot more than what's on this piece of paper, by the way. You expand them to your needs. This is the ones where they're required. You can put that in there, or they're not required by the tribal council or the Board of Commissioners, or when they were adopted. But make sure you have something like that. Do I still need a policy? We're just an office, not designated housing in. Dorothy, I think I'm going to have to ask you something on the side about that. But yes, you should have maybe a copy of theirs, of your housing associations, organizations, bylaws, and things like that. Which policies are required by whom? Sort of like the other ones we did. NAHASDA requires you to set income limits. Moderate income families must be charged more than 30% of adjusted income. So anybody that between 80 and 100%, unless you have something in your policy saying that they were income eligible and below the 80% threshold when they moved in, and that you're not going, and that you'll let them continue in your program, and that you're not going to charge them more, those families that are above that threshold are supposed to be charged more. And it all goes back to your policy, and we'll hit on that later. Requirement of a credit check, that's up to your recipient policies, and that's an internal decision. Establishments of your priorities and admission, again, that's local level decision. Indian preference and tenant selection, that's NAHASDA. Non-low income participants must have a need that cannot be met without your assistance, IHBG assistance. That's a NAHASDA requirement. Established policies for management and operation. Again, that's NAHASDA. Your utility allowances. You don't have to offer utility allowances anymore. That's a recipient decision. Recertify every 6 months. That's a recipient decision. When are you going to do it? Once a year? The thing that will get you into trouble with HUD quicker than anything else, you are not allowed to charge somebody that is below 80% of adjusted median income over 30% of that household's income, even if you have a maximum and a minimum rent. Somebody should be doing those calculations. Your staff should have it posted. When you talk to your tenants, especially their first move-in, you tell them if they experience a reduction in their household income, they need to contact you immediately. No, we're not going to throw you out, but we're not allowed to charge you over 30%. Okay, that's a huge, that'll get you into trouble quicker. You know, if you don't want to collect all the money that you're supposed to, they're not going to look at it very nicely. You charge somebody over 30% of median income, you're in trouble. And you'll have to pay it back to that family. So don't make that mistake. Charge a low-income family less than 30% of that adjusted income. Conduct criminal background checks. Again, that's a recipient one. You know, so we have lots of policies and procedures. They fall into different places. What is a procedure? It'll tell you what to do, when to do it, and who is responsible for doing it. That procedure establishes a specific method into which a function is to be performed, assigns that responsibility, and describes specific actions. They're necessary. A good set of written procedures increases the likelihood that your programs are going to be administered properly, delivered in a way that the staff will know their responsibilities, implement it in a manner that ensures performance objectives are met according to your established policies, consistently delivered, understood and trusted by the public, delivered efficiently with as many households served as possible. Okay, now that again is a recipient decision. Am I going to serve 20 families with down payment assistance at $10,000, or am I going to serve 40 families at $5,000? That's your decision there. Easy delivered by new staff with little interruption to workflow. I mean, do you have something in place where a new person can come in and read that and understand what path they're supposed to follow? Understand and accurately describe by your staff, your members of your board, and your tribal council. Do they all know why you do the things you do? So your policies and your procedures compared. Your policies, it's a set of principles, rules, guidelines formulated by your organization. It has a widespread application, non-negotiable, and they change infrequently. They are expressed in broad terms, statements of what and or why, and answer a lot of your major operational issues. Your procedures, on the other hand, are a series of steps followed in a regular, definite order. They have a much narrower focus, subject to change, have continuous improvement. You can always improve those procedures if you find a better way. Are a more detailed description of the activities your staff is supposed to undertake, or your almost even, sometimes it applies to the tenants, are statements of how, when, and who, and sometimes what. And they detail that process, how you get there. So this is an admissions and occupancy policy outline. We're going to go through that rather quickly, but it's in there so you can look at yours. This is just an outline to see if you have, maybe I need to put this in there if I'm developing one. Your summary, your laws and your customs of your tribe, prohibited use of premises. I walked in when I first started and there was somebody that had an engine hanging from the ceiling in a 2-story unit. No, that is not allowed. Same house, different participants. They were skinning and trapping, and they were drying their stuff in there in the winter. Nope, that's not allowed either. Hold the boat, you know. So prohibited use of premises, make sure that they're very well spelled out. Your law enforcement, when you're going to use them, what jurisdiction they have, jurisdiction of whom. Are they cross-deputized? Do you have tribal police? Are you bringing in local sheriffs, you know? Overview and history of your programs. What's the mission of your housing entity? What is the management capacity? Organization structure of you as the recipient. Your commitment to ethics. Your conflict of interest. Your applicable codes and laws. Your tribal codes. Other applicable requirements. Partnerships. Your overview. Purposes of your policies, the contents of it, your applicability of your policies, your program applicability, staff and officials, updating and revising it, when you can do that, who you have to get a hold of, how long notice are you going to give them, number and gender, authorization of the executive director, your Indian preference, tribal requirements, NAHASDA requirements, eligibility, your definitions of your family and your household members, that overview. Family and household, family breakup. What's going to happen? Are you going to allow the remaining family to live there? That's where your life estate codes you might want to talk about. I've dealt with quite a few tribes lately that don't have it spelled out in their old mutual help things real well. You need to know that if you're on trust land, only a tribal member from that particular piece of trust land can inherit that house. You can give them a life estate, but you can't give them that property or any improvements thereon. That's part of BIA regulations. Make sure you understand those when you put those documents together. Head of household, spouse, co-head, other adults, full-time students, and the laws that, deductions that go with that. Elderly, near elderly persons, elderly families. I work with one tribe that has a really, really low definition age requirement for an elderly family. It's got repercussions all the way around because now the elderly deduction, kicks in at an earlier age, and there, the other disabled household elderly, kicks in at a different age. You have to make sure that you look at things all the way through, and the implications it can charge or cause. The preferences, if you give an elderly preference, things like that, though also. Persons with disabilities, disabled families, guests, making sure that you let them know that they are responsible for the conduct of their guest, period. Foster children, foster adults, we're going to discuss that tomorrow. Absent family members, live-in aides, guardians, successorship. Eligibility criteria, income eligibility, targeting, social security numbers. Families' consent to release of information, denial of admission, overview, required denial of admission, reasons for denial, use of illegal substances, screening, criteria for deciding to deny admission to anybody, prohibition against denial of assistance to victims of domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, do you have VAWA in place? Consideration of derogatory findings, notice of eligibility or denial. You're supposed to notify somebody when you deny them. Make sure when you write policies and procedures, if you give somebody 14 days, 14 calendar or business, always define what type of days, okay? Your applicant waiting list, tenant selection, your application process, the forms, the process, the charges, if you give any, communication, accessibility. Do you require them in writing? Do you require them to be brought in person? Do you take them through the mail? Placement on your waiting list, essential information for waiting list placement, applicant files, your filing requirements, your file management. Do you have inactive files, file retention? What type of confidentiality do you have in place? We're going to touch on a lot of these things. These are things you need to start thinking about to make sure that your A&O policies talk about these. Your overview, your waiting list organization, how you're going to do that. Basics, priorities, preferences, opening and closing your waiting list. Do you do that? Placement on the waiting list, entering new applicants. How do you outreach to your family? Reporting changes in family circumstances, updating your waiting list, removal from the waiting list. That one will get you in trouble equally as fast. You do not remove somebody from your waiting list without a policy that allows you to do so, documentation as who did it, when they did it, why they did it, and where it went. Because you'll get a finding for that. Reporting requirements. Your tenant selection. Waiting list selection, selection methods, priorities, preferences, notification of selection. How long do you give them to accept that unit? If they turn it down, how many times are you going to allow them to do that? Are you going to put them to the bottom or let them stay on top? All of those things have to be written out in there. Your final eligibility determination, your occupancy standards and unit offers, your overview, determining that unit size, exceptions to your occupancy standards, your unit offers, overview, number of offers you're going to put forth, time limit for unit offer, acceptance or refusal, refusals of unit offers, how many times you're going to allow them to do it, what are your requirements for accessible units, designated housing, occupancy use, who's your authorized occupants, exclusive use, what about your guest and your visitors policies, what about your unauthorized occupants or temporary absence from your unit, your annual income, your income and your rent determinations, the overview, household composition and income, annual income, earned income disallowances, business income, assets, periodic payments, payments in lieu of earnings, welfare assistance, periodic and determinable allowances, additional exclusions from annual income. Your adjusted income, determining adjusted income, your dependent deductions, elderly and disabled family deductions, medical expense deductions, disability assistance expenses deductions, childcare expense deductions, permissive deductions, and other deductions that perhaps your tribe put in place. Calculation of that rent, the overview of your income-based rental calculations, minimum rents, financial hardships affecting that minimum rent. Are you giving a utility allowance, prorated rent for mixed families, flat rents, family choice in rents, your exhibits, your annual income inclusions, annual income exclusions, treatment of family assets, earned income disallowance, the effect of a welfare benefit reduction, verification, family consent to release of information, overview of the requirements, the verification requirements, upfront income, third-party written and oral, self-certification, verifying the family information, legal identity, social security, documentation of age, because that affects your deductions, family relationships, student status, documentation of a disability, citizenship, eligible immigration, verification of preference statuses. And all of these, there's, your child care, your medical, your zero, your alimony, your leasing and your moving, your move in, payments under the lease. What about security deposits? Do you allow, does it have to be all paid up front or do you allow payments? What about a dwelling lease that no longer lives in that unit? Can you transfer that family to another unit? Modifications of the lease agreement. So all of this should be covered in your stuff. And then your whole move-in process. Your overview of your maintenance and inspections, when you're going to do it, that you expect quiet enjoyment rules. They can't be noisy and affecting other people's things. Your reexaminations, your recalculations of your rents, your pet policies, transfer policies. There's a lot of things you have to look at here. Family debt to you as a recipient. We wouldn't allow somebody to move into our housing. We would not take their application until we were paid in full, and our utility authority, because we ran the water and sewer. You don't start by being in the hole. had to be paid off first. So all of that can be built in there too. Your program integrity, under or overpayment, criminal prosecution, fraud, your waiting list, you have to make sure that you have your policies and procedures that deal with that. Family characteristics, estimated anticipated income, what size, location, and type of home for the family, whether they're suitable for participation. You're going to deem people suitable in accordance with your local selection criteria, whether they can qualify for a preference. Your written application should be time and date stamped when you receive them. It should be accepted and processed to make sure that you determine them eligible. The staff should document any communication with your applicants and removals from the waiting list. The staff should help your applicants complete their applications. And you pick a staff member that's good-hearted, that doesn't look down on people. You don't want your snooty person in that type of position. Your selection policies, you have to develop a selection policy with your preferences. If you're going to establish a preference for members of your tribe, people with special needs, veterans, certain types of families, all of that needs to be addressed. And then that non-low income assistance policy. This is sample. The ATIHA will provide assistance to non-low income families to the greatest extent feasible in accordance with NAHASDA. This policy describes the exception to the low income requirement whereby non-low income Indian families can receive assistance under NAHASDA. The method for determining and documenting when housing need cannot reasonably be met without NAHASDA assistance. The process to request HUD approval to assist a non-low income family, and the applicability. All non-low income families requesting housing assistance in any of the 1937 Housing Act or housing assistance with NAHASDA funds. In order to provide assistance to non-low income Indian families, certain conditions have to be met. In all cases, you have to determine and document there's a need for housing for each family which cannot reasonably be met without assistance. You have to state within your IHP that you intend to use up to 10% of your annual grant amount to assist your Indian families with incomes that fall between 80 and 100% of the median income without HUD approval. HUD approval is required if you plan to use more than 10% of your annual grant amount for such assistance, or when you plan to provide assistance to a family with incomes that are above that 100% of median income. In that particular case, unless you deem them essential, that would be considered a model activity, and you would have to get that model activity approved. A non-low income Indian family cannot receive the same benefits as provided to a low income Indian family. There's, and we'll go through that later on. There's calculations that you have to do. A determination of need, which cannot reasonably be met without your assistance, but should consider and not limited to inadequate housing, does not provide adequate space for privacy, temporary housing and homelessness, cost burden, inaccessibility to financing. When they determine that the family is seeking assistance, they don't have a legitimate housing need, you actually would have to make that determination and notify the family in writing of your determination that you can't assist them. Determination that the housing need cannot be met without your assistance considered, or can consider rental and homeownership housing. If they're an inadequate rental housing, income and assets, if you have to look if they have sufficient income, creditworthiness that would allow them to obtain adequate housing. Private and governmental programs, you should determine if they could qualify for a 184, a VA, your USDA properties. You can look at your housing market conditions. What's the current availability of housing, both rental and home ownership? Now, you're going to have a hard time helping people with this provision if your housing entity offers fair market housing, or the tribe has its own housing that perhaps even you run, that is not NAHASDA assisted, then these participants should be in that property, okay? Housing location for families who reside within the reservation or Indian area and would not consider moving from the reservation or Indian area. You need only consider the availability of housing on the reservation or Indian area when determining if that housing need can be met without that assistance. You can look at overcrowded, so this is a policy that you can look at, have your staff, have your legal department, look at for perhaps your non-low income assistance policy. You have to have that documentation of that housing need, documentation supporting the determination of the housing need that cannot reasonably be met without your IHBG assistance. It could include, not limited to, property inspections, a statement from temporary housing facilities stating that the family's been residing in a facility because they have no other alternative. There's lots of things built in here. This is just for your further review, or to compare to yours and see what you have in there. Rejection letters from financial institutions, letters from state, local, federal agencies, notes including names and phone numbers of persons the family has contacted in attempt of securing housing, copy of tax returns, payroll stub, rent receipts, statement by the head of household explaining that they have a housing need that they cannot be met without your assistance. Poor credit by itself does not constitute need. When HUD approval is required before a family can obtain assistance, a copy of your documentation and request from HUD approval should be sent to your area office of Native American programs. When it's not required, you still need to keep that documentation on site for future HUD and audit review. So essential families, do you have an essential families policy? You guys can fill that out while I'm doing this. If you want to bring that up, my girl, Q. So PIH Notice 2014-02, Essential Families, a non-low income family. Can you move it a little bit more for me? I'm trying to do two things at once. Thank you. You have to determine if that family is essential to the well-being of your Native or your Alaskan families. The need for that housing cannot be met again without your assistance. Families assisted under that provision can receive the same amount of benefits as a low-income family. And you look under 24 CFR 1110. They don't count as non-low income for your 10% authority. They don't require that HUD approval. The guidance on documenting these determinations is covered further within that notice. So there's Notice 2014-02 talks about your essential families, and you need to have a policy in place. The criteria and the rationale for determining if that family is essential should be clearly described within your policy. Documentation has to be maintained. This is one where you'll see that you should have documentation, keep it from 3 years or 4 years. When it comes to admissions, that needs to go and stay in the current file for the life of that family. And that also applies to conflict of interest, and if you deem them essential or any of those special provisions. That needs to stay there and go from current file to current file. They could be there 25 years, you get them a new file, you still move that new information. And the criteria and the rationale. So we've got 12 that don't know, 2 that says no. Okay, so thank you very much. You need to have an essential families if you're ever going to deem somebody essential. You also have to clarify, if you want to close that up, sweetheart, in that policy, who can make that, who can do the deeming? Is it the executive director? Is it the tribal council? Board of Commissioners. I was allowed as the executive director to deem someone as essential. Also make sure that you have something in that policy that you can ask them to leave when they are no longer deemed essential. Let's say you put them in there as a dentist and he no longer is a dentist for your clinics. Well, then you don't need to give him housing as long as you have that way out. So does not require HUD approval. You can serve them if the family is essential to the well-being of your families and of your Indian and Alaskan families. The needs cannot be met without IHBG assistance. You have to have an essential families policy and make sure your policies address if you no longer deem them essential. Here are some of the determinations of need that you can use. Documentations, and then you may also make exceptions for your law enforcement. I'm about 2 minutes late, guys. I'm sorry. And then please stay here for her survey. It's very quick. Your law enforcement, Section 201 of NAHASDA allows us to address the provision of housing for housing assistance to law enforcement officers on an Indian reservation. So you should have a law enforcement officer's policy. The officer has to be employed full-time, okay, by the federal, state, county, tribal, or other unit of local government. They have to be sworn to uphold and make arrest for violations in federal, state, county, or tribal law, so they have to be an arresting officer. In addition, the program must determine the presence of that law enforcement officer may deter crime. Law enforcement officers assisted under this provision can receive the same benefits as a low-income family, so you don't have to charge them that increased rent, and they don't count against your 10% authority. You just have to deem that they're going to determine that, deem that their presence is going to deter crime, and it does. We had fair market housing. Some of the nicest housing that is around. We're 25 miles from our state police post. I think I had 5 of them out here at one time, not including, that's excluding. We had 2 sheriffs and Bay Mills law enforcement out of here. That is one huge deterrent, and that was what I'd ask them. Please keep your squad cars in visible sight. When somebody breaks a corner and, wow, there's a state cop. They hit the next corner, there's a sheriff. There's Bay Mills law enforcement. They're going to think twice about coming into your area and trying to start up drugs or whatever. We had very, very, very low drug use, breaking and enterings, anything like that when you have that show of force around. So it's a good deterrent. References. What families are eligible for affordable housing? Low income, non-low income family, in accordance with 1010. A family can receive housing assistance on a reservation or Native Alaskan area if the family's housing need cannot reasonably be met without such assistance, and you determine that presence of that family on the reservation or Native Alaskan area is essential to the well-beings of Native American and Native Alaskan families. HUD will check when they do their monitoring, and sometimes your auditors. Your program files must show proof that the family was low income at the time of admission, and I had them come back. I was there 28 years, and they looked at houses, people that were there before I got there. So they do a random sampling of 10% of your files, okay? So always keep proof of admission. If you have somebody that was not eligible or you have no proof of admission, you can't find those files, put it on the front of the file, make a big staple on that, and find it yourself during your self-monitoring, okay? Don't try to hide it. This is what I found. I'm sorry, there was a mistake made. There's nothing I can do. They'll pull another file or whatever, or they'll just, already discovered, so. If the participant is non-low income at the time of admission, you must have proof the need for housing cannot be reasonably met without assistance, or that family meets the definition of essential family. And is there proof that the family meets the requirements under your approved policy and procedure prior to admission? Always move proof of eligibility of admission from file to file and always keep that in your current file. Questions. So I'm going to look at questions real quick. I'm going to go through this list. If you want to start telling them about your requested form that you need, my girl.
Sure, thank you. I just want to thank you real quick, Cheryl. That was a great presentation. I think there is one question from Philip. Will they only pay 30% of their income? What's this question?
Police officers. They can pay, yeah. Yes. That's all they would pay if you put them under the law enforcement. Or you can, if you have a different program, you can charge them whatever, but that's up to you. But if you'd like to put them in there, you only have to charge them up to 30%. If by some reason your tribe charges 25% or 20%, that's what they would pay.
Okay, looks like we still have some people typing, so I'm going to go ahead and launch the survey.
Joshua, we're here for 2 more days.
The registration link is also in the links. So if you would like to view tomorrow's webinar, please register so that way you can have access to it.
Yes, it's NAHASDA 1, 2, and 3, guys. So there's 3 days full of this. Not duplicated.
So as Cheryl just said, we do have NAHASDA required policies and procedures tomorrow. It'll be at 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, 12 p.m. Mountain Time, and 11 a.m. Pacific. Registration is free as always, so please register if it's easier. The link is in the web links. Feel free to access this and any other recording webinars online in our website, www.nativelearningcenter.com. We have a Cathedra webinar tab and a recorded webinars section. You can click on any one of the webinars that we have done for the past 18 months. Please feel free to view them and share them with your friends and colleagues. Check out our upcoming events as well on our social media sites such as Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Snapchat. We even have a podcast that you can also find us. You can find that on Simplecast, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Once again, I want to thank everyone for joining us and all your participation. And thank you again, Cheryl.
Oh, no worries. That's the part where you remind me of a NASCAR driver going through their sponsors.
Gotta get them all out there.
I hope to see you guys all back tomorrow.
Thank you again, everyone.